There is a word that can erase a person in an instant. It requires no evidence. It needs no context. Simply speak it, and everything human disappears. For centuries, this word has been used to decide who deserves to be understood and who can be condemned without question. Cannibalism. We use it to shut down questions before they are even asked. But what if that word did not mean the same thing everywhere? Throughout this documentary, you will discover 7 real societies for whom cannibalism was not a single act, but a cultural response to death, war, or the social order that sustained an entire community. Understanding it does not mean justifying it. It means daring to look beyond the taboo. Stay until the end, because you will understand why this word says far less about those who practiced it, and far more about those who used it to judge. If this kind of documentary brings you value, you can subscribe to CronoPlanet and join us on this journey. Now then, let us begin. 1. Wari. Cannibalism as an act of love. Imagine the jungle closing in around you. The air is thick, the humidity clings to your skin. There are no marked paths, only slow rivers and vegetation that seems endless. Here, in the western Amazon, there are communities whose relationship with life and death does not follow our rules. Not because they were more cruel, but because they learned to live with loss in a different way. The Wari lived for centuries in these forests of what is now Western Brazil. Their isolation was neither an ideological position nor a conscious resistance to the outside world. It was the natural result of the land itself. Dense river systems, impenetrable jungle, and an almost total distance from the world we know shaped a worldview in which the body, memory, and family bonds carried real, tangible weight. Here, death is not hidden. It is confronted. From a Western perspective, the Wari were reduced to a single word, spoken as a verdict: cannibals. For decades, their name became synonymous with primitive brutality. That label, however, concealed a far more complex reality. For the Wari, cannibalism had nothing to do with aggression or survival. It was a funerary ritual. Now imagine the moment of farewell. When a member of the community died, the body was not seen as something separate from the person they had been. The corpse remained charged with emotional meaning. The idea of burying it, of leaving it alone and cold in the ground, was experienced as a painful rupture of the bond. Within their worldview, consuming part of the deceased's body was an act of compassion, intended to accompany them through their final passage. Keep the loved one from slowly dissolving into the earth, and transform loss into one last gesture of closeness. This was neither an impulsive act nor an everyday practice. It followed precise rules, timing, and meanings, and was reserved exclusively for the period of mourning. Nothing about it matched the image of the savage cannibal constructed by the West from afar. That balance collapsed the moment outsiders arrived. Missionaries, officials, and agents of the Brazilian state disrupted it abruptly. The funerary ritual was immediately prohibited, interpreted solely through a moral framework detached from its cultural and emotional purpose. For the Wari, this did not simply mean abandoning an ancestral practice. It meant learning to say goodbye to their dead in an entirely new way, imposed and emotionally foreign. Many elders later described the impact of burying their loved ones for the first time. It was a wound, a silent rupture with their way of understanding love, farewell, and memory. Today, the ritual is no longer practiced, yet its memory remains alive in the testimonies of those who experienced it. not as something shameful, but as a different and profoundly human way of facing loss. Here, the first crack appears in our idea of cannibalism. Because if an act is born from mourning, guided by affection, and shaped by the need to ease absence, can something that horrifies us so deeply be, for others, a form of love? But cannibalism did not speak of affection in every society. In some, it was punishment. It was law. And when justice is not written into codes or courts, it takes another form. There was a place where the body did not close a period of mourning. It sealed a sentence. That is where the next chapter begins. 2. Lebedastu, cannibalism as tribal law. In the highlands of northern Sumatra, far from the coast and from the trade routes that for centuries connected Asia to the rest of the world, a society developed according to its own rules. A society without a state, without prisons, and without courts in the modern sense. But not without law. The Batak were not a chaotic or inherently violent people. On the contrary, their social organization rested on strict norms, councils of elders, and a deep sense of communal order. In the absence of a central authority, the cohesion of the group depended on something fundamental: justice. From a European perspective, however, the Batak entered history burdened with one of the gravest accusations a culture can face: cannibalism. During the 18th and 19th centuries, missionaries, traders, and colonial officials spread disturbing accounts of extreme punishments and incomprehensible rituals. Over time, these stories hardened into a shorthand for barbarism. The reality, however, was more precise and far more uncomfortable. Among the Batak, cannibalism functioned as an exceptional punishment within a ritual system of justice. It was applied only in cases of crimes deemed irreparable: grave betrayal, murder within the clan, or extreme violations of taboo. This was not personal revenge. The punishment was not decided by a single individual or by a wounded family. It emerged from a ritualized process in which the community determined that the offender had irreversibly broken the collective pact. Within that framework, the purpose of punishment was clear: to restore order. Its aim was not to instill fear, but to close a rupture that endangered everyone. Here lies a crucial distinction often erased in colonial narratives. For the Batak, justice was not synonymous with cruelty. The act was charged with legal and ritual symbolism, not with pleasure or hatred. With the arrival of Dutch colonial power, this structure was rapidly dismantled. The traditional legal system was banned and replaced by external laws that ignored the clan's internal logic. This form of judicial cannibalism came to be described solely as proof of savagery, stripped of context and nuance. In this way, an exceptional and tightly regulated practice was reduced, in Western records, to a monstrous caricature. Today, that system no longer exists. Batak society was integrated into the modern state, and those tribal laws gradually disappeared. The stigma, however, remains, because when a culture is judged solely by its most extreme punishment, everything else becomes invisible. This leads to an uncomfortable question that reaches beyond the past. Where does barbarism truly begin? In the punishment a society imposes to protect itself? Or in the gaze that condemns it without attempting to understand? So far, we have spoken of mourning and of law. But there were cultures where cannibalism did not close a wound. It opened one, not as punishment, not as a funerary rite, but as war. And to understand that, we must return to a time when the enemy was not simply eliminated, but absorbed into the memory of the people. 3. Tupinambá. Cannibalism as ritual warfare. Long before Europe set foot on the coasts of South America, war already existed, but it did not always carry the meaning we assign to it today. Along the Atlantic shoreline of what is now Brazil, among coastal forests, rivers, and fortified villages, lived the Tupinambá, an indigenous people for whom conflict was not merely a struggle over territory, but a social language, one that preserved collective memory and maintained balance between clans. From the earliest European accounts of the 16th century, the Tupinambá were portrayed as fearsome warriors. What unsettled chroniclers most, however, was not the fighting itself, but what came afterward. When an enemy was captured, execution did not follow immediately. There was no senseless torture, no impulsive killing. Instead, the prisoner became part of the community that had defeated them, living among their captors, sharing meals, and taking part in everyday life. For weeks, sometimes months, the captive knew what awaited them, and they accepted it. For the Tupinambá, dying in this context was not a humiliation. It marked the closure of a cycle of warfare, honor, and reciprocity. The final ritual, which included the ritual consumption of the defeated enemy, was not intended to satisfy hunger or inspire terror. Its meaning was deeply cultural, to appropriate the strength, courage, and memory of the adversary. Within their worldview, the enemy was not an object. They were someone worthy of remembrance. This form of warfare followed clear and established rules. When Europeans encountered these practices, they interpreted them through their own moral framework. Reduced to the word cannibalism, Tupinambá ritual warfare was quickly transformed into irrefutable evidence of savagery. Paradoxically, those same chronicles omitted something essential: that in Europe, at the very same time, public executions, dismemberments, and wars of extermination were carried out in the names of kings, religions, and states. Here, the realization becomes unsettling. Because if ritualized violence was labeled barbarism, what name should be given to wars that annihilated entire cities without rules or return? As colonization advanced, the Tupinambá system was dismantled. Ritual warfare disappeared, not because it was understood, but because it was crushed. With it vanished a way of understanding conflict that, though extreme, had been integrated into a coherent social order. When we look closely, the question shifts away from what they did and towards something far more uncomfortable. Who decides which forms of war are considered legitimate and which are forever marked as barbaric? Yet not every culture used the enemy's body to commemorate victory. In some societies, the body marked the beginning of something else. Not the end of a life, but the start of another. This is how we enter a rite in which growing up meant crossing a threshold the outside world never attempted to understand. Barker 4. Biami, cannibalism as a rite of passage. In some regions of the world, growing up is not a gradual process. It is an abrupt crossing. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, among dense jungles and scattered villages, the Biami lived for generations in near total isolation, not by ideological choice, but because the territory itself, mountainous, humid, and difficult to traverse, kept them beyond the reach of outside influence for centuries. In this context, childhood is not left behind with time. It is broken. For the Biami, becoming an adult meant passing through strict initiation rituals reserved exclusively for men. secret ceremonies heavy with symbolism, in which the body ceased to be merely flesh and became identity. This is where one of the most misunderstood practices by the outside world appears. In very specific rituals, neither everyday nor generalized, a minimal and deeply symbolic form of ritual consumption took place. It was not punishment, nor an expression of violence, but a means of incorporating the essence of the community and sealing the passage from one state to another. Within this worldview, the body was not separate from being. It carried strength, belonging, and continuity. Ritual, symbolic consumption marked the emergence of someone new, recognized by the wider community. These practices were governed by strict rules and absolute secrecy toward the uninitiated. They were not spectacles or displays, but closed ceremonies whose meaning existed only for those who had crossed the threshold. When outside contact finally arrived, through missionaries, colonial administrations, and observers, the impact was immediate. The rituals were banned and erased without reinterpretation or understanding. With their disappearance came the loss of more than a single practice, a way of marking the transition into adulthood, a symbolic language that had shaped entire generations. Today, the Biami no longer perform these rites, yet their memory remains as a cultural scar, the trace of a time when growing up meant passing through something the modern world cannot or chooses not to name. This leaves us with an unavoidable question. How many human rituals would seem incomprehensible if we viewed them without knowing the culture that gave them meaning? By this point, the journey has already revealed how much complexity a single word can conceal when examined within its real context. If this journey has value for you, you can continue with us by subscribing to CronoPlanet. Next, we move into a different setting, where cannibalism ceases to be a cultural practice and becomes a narrative imposed from the outside. 5. Fang. Cannibalism as a colonial stigma. For centuries, when Europe imagined Africa, it did so through fear. A vast and largely unknown continent was reduced to a sequence of stories marked by darkness, violence, and cannibalism. Within that mental construction, certain peoples of Central Africa occupied a particularly uncomfortable place. Not because their societies were more violent than others, but because they fit too neatly into a narrative imposed from the outside. In the forests of what are now Gabon and Cameroon, this Bantu people of Central Africa organized themselves into extended clans, with complex spiritual systems, elaborate funerary rituals, and a social life deeply anchored in ancestor veneration. Clear norms, defined hierarchies, and symbols of authority structured daily life. Far from chaos, there was order. By the late 19th century, however, as European colonial expansion advanced, disturbing reports began to circulate. Missionaries, explorers, and administrators described human sacrifice, secret practices, and episodes of ritual cannibalism, often based on indirect testimonies, flawed translations, or interested interpretations. Some symbolic practices did exist, but not with the frequency, meaning, or violence those accounts claimed. This is where the crucial shift occurs, because the primary purpose of those reports was not to understand a culture, but to render it legible as a perceived threat. Cannibalism became an extraordinarily effective narrative tool. If a people could be portrayed as monstrous, external intervention was automatically justified. To civilize, to evangelize, to administer. All could be done in the name of a supposed humanity that never asked for consent. In this process, rituals linked to ancestor worship, initiatory societies, and symbols of power were torn from their context. What had been exceptional was presented as habitual. What was symbolic was treated as literal. Nuance disappeared. Once colonial control was consolidated, many of these practices were banned indiscriminately. Their social function and role within communal balance were never examined. They were eliminated as part of a broader program of cultural control. The outcome was twofold. On one hand, stigma. For generations, these communities were associated with an image of brutality that bore little resemblance to their historical reality. On the other, cultural rupture. Knowledge, rituals, and social structures vanished without ever being understood. Today, these populations are part of modern states. Cannibalism has no place in their daily lives. Yet the colonial era narrative continues to circulate, repeated in books, documentaries, and conversations that rarely pause to ask who wrote the story and for what purpose. Because when fear becomes official discourse, truth is often the first casualty. At that point, the question shifts away from what these cultures did and moves towards something far more unsettling. How many stories about cannibalism were created not to understand a reality, but to exercise power over it? But fear was not always the force that shaped the narrative. Some societies, cannibalism was not an external accusation, but an internal language of power. Not to inspire terror in others, but to establish hierarchy within the group itself. This is where the body ceases to be a stigma and becomes prestige. 6. Yitmul, cannibalism as prestige and power. In northern Papua New Guinea, the Sepik River flows slowly and heavily, as if carrying centuries of memory. Along its banks rise wooden villages, elevated ceremonial houses, and totems carved with intertwined human and animal figures. Here, nothing is decorative. Everything carries meaning. This society was organized around a clear and deeply ritualized hierarchy. Power was not inherited by blood alone. It had to be acknowledged. And that recognition was not granted. It was earned. In this world, the enemy was more than an adversary. They were bearers of force. Warfare did not seek total annihilation. Its primary function was to reinforce status, demonstrate bravery, and consolidate authority within the group. Conflict generated prestige, but that prestige needed to be made visible. This is where one of the most difficult practices to understand from the outside emerges. Within very specific ritual contexts, cannibalism was linked to male status, not as an impulsive act or an expression of terror, but as an extreme symbol of power. Consuming parts of a defeated enemy represented the appropriation of their energy, courage, and capacity for leadership. The body was not understood as a physical boundary. It functioned as a vessel of qualities. Strength could be transmitted. Authority could be absorbed. These rituals were not accessible to everyone. Participation was restricted to those considered worthy. Here lies a fundamental distinction. Fear was not the goal. Authority was. While fear disorganizes, ritual power creates order. It defines who leads, who protects, and who occupies each place within the social system. With the arrival of the outside world, colonial administrations, missionaries, and observers, these practices were prohibited. Ritual cannibalism disappeared not through internal transformation, but through external interruption. The social structure changed. Prestige ceased to be measured through ancestral symbols and began to depend on values foreign to their worldview. Today, these practices no longer exist, yet the accounts remain, often stripped of context and reduced to simple stories of horror. And still, when examined closely, the realization is unsettling. Throughout human history, power has rarely been abstract. It has always required symbols, sometimes through laws, sometimes through monuments, and at other times through rituals that push the limits of what is tolerable. What changes is not the need for power, but the way each culture chooses to represent it. This brings us to an uncomfortable question, just as this journey approaches its decisive point. Has power always required extreme symbols? Or do we simply refuse to recognize them when they do not resemble our own? So far, we have seen how a single practice could be love, law, war, stigma, and power. But one story still remains, one in which tradition carried not only cultural meaning, but invisible consequences. A real case that forced humanity to confront the boundary between belief, science, and tragedy. That is where everything you have seen so far comes together. And that is where we are heading now. 7. 4. When tradition has invisible consequences. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, far from the coast and from the most traveled colonial routes, there lived for generations a people who inspired no fear. They inspired curiosity. They were not feared warriors. They built no fortifications. They lived in scattered villages, surrounded by mountainous jungle, where daily life revolved around family, horticulture, and a deep respect for the dead. For the Foray, death was not a definitive rupture. It was a transformation. When a member of the community died, the body was not seen as something that should vanish beneath the ground. It remained part of the group. Farewell meant integrating the deceased one final time among the living. Here, a practice emerged that would change history. For decades, the Foray practiced funerary endocannibalism, the ritual consumption of parts of the deceased as an act of mourning, spiritual continuity, and communal care. There was no violence, no punishment. What existed was attention, respect, and meaning. Women and children, traditionally responsible for funerary rites, played the most active role. They prepared the body and took part in the ritual, convinced that through this act, the spirit of the deceased would return to the clan from within. For a long time, nothing appeared out of place, until something began to fracture. In the mid-20th century, doctors and anthropologists working in the region observed a disturbing phenomenon. People, primarily women and children, began to develop a strange illness, progressive and inevitably fatal. The earliest symptoms were subtle: tremors, loss of balance, difficulty coordinating movement. Later came involuntary laughter, neurological deterioration, and the inability to swallow. Finally, death. The Four called it Kuru. For years, no one could explain its origin. It did not behave like known infections. It did not spread in familiar ways. There was no treatment. Most unsettling was its pattern. It affected almost exclusively those who took part in funerary rituals, and within that group, women and children with particular severity. The revelation was slow to arrive. But when it did, it transformed medicine forever. Research led by scientists such as Carlton Gajdusek demonstrated that Kuru was not caused by bacteria or viruses, but by something entirely different: prions. misfolded proteins capable of triggering neurodegenerative disease when ingested. For the first time, science revealed that a cultural practice rooted in love and mourning could carry invisible consequences, impossible to foresee without biological knowledge. The discovery was so decisive that it led to the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1976. For the Wari, however, scientific progress came at a devastating cost. Authorities immediately banned the funerary ritual. There was no negotiation, no gradual adaptation. Cannibalism was completely eradicated. Over time, the disease disappeared. Kurus ceased to be recorded. But something else vanished as well. The way the Wari said goodbye to their dead, the means by which they transformed grief into unity. A spiritual language that had defined entire generations was replaced by a prohibition. Necessary, yes, but deeply traumatic. Here, cannibalism fits none of the categories we have seen before. It was a tradition born of affection, with consequences no one could have predicted. At this point, the original promise of this documentary is fully realized. Because taboo does not always conceal violence. Sometimes it hides shared ignorance. Sometimes it reveals the boundary between culture and biology. And sometimes it forces us to accept that progress, too, leaves irreparable losses behind. And so the final question no longer points at the fore. It turns toward us. What happens when an ancestral belief carries consequences no one could see? And who decides what must disappear forever in the name of progress? If you've made it this far, you are no longer in the same place where this documentary began. You've seen how a single taboo could take the form of mourning, law, war, prestige, and, in the end, an invisible tragedy. This journey challenges a comfortable assumption. The idea that one word is enough to understand or condemn an entire culture. Because when we reduce societies to a label, we stop seeing the people behind it. And when understanding disappears, judgment takes its place. Perhaps that is the final revelation, that the real abyss does not lie in what other peoples did, but in how quickly we learn to condemn them without listening. From this point on, the story no longer continues in remote territories, rituals, or anthropological archives. It continues here. Which part of this journey changed the way you see this human taboo? If you feel that this documentary should not end here, write it in the comments using the keyword second part. And if you want to keep exploring cultures and human choices that resist simple explanations, you can subscribe to CronoPlanet and turn on notifications to join us in upcoming documentaries. Remember, there are still stories that cannot be understood at first glance. And this journey, far from ending, has just opened a door. See you in the next story.